Sky was pale grey as I stepped off the train, my knees aching with every movement. The others stood laughing on the snowy platform, clapping me on the back, calling me a coward for heading home early. But I couldn't go on, not with my old ailments flaring up again, rheumatism, and a congenital heart issue. I waved goodbye. They told me to keep the stove warm for when they returned. I never saw them again. Days turned to weeks, but no telegram came, no word. When the first search teams returned, their faces told me everything. Their tent had been found slashed open from the inside. My friends' belongings still neatly arranged, boots untouched. 9 sets of barefoot tracks led into the forest, disappearing into the trees. They said I was lucky, but I've never felt anything but haunted. At first, it seemed like a simple tragedy in the snow. In February of 1959, 9 experienced Soviet hikers vanished while trekking through the Ural Mountains, an expedition planned with precision, mapped by topographic engineers and approved by state sporting commissions. The students were all young, bright, and well-trained. They planned their route with military discipline and academic rigor. Each of them carried a journal, a camera, and enough equipment to survive weeks in the wild. But despite all that, they did not return from the journey. What did return were horrifying reports. Broken bodies, missing eyes, torn clothing, and silence hanging over their last camp like a veil. The few belongings that did make it back, film rolls, torn notebooks, half-burned logs, raised more questions than they answered. One of the bodies was found with a shattered skull, another with her ribs crushed inward. Another was missing her tongue, and several had stripped off their clothes despite the sub-zero cold. And on some of their garments, inexplicably, traces of radiation were found. In the wake of their disappearances, rumors began to swirl. Whispers of secret weapons tests, madness, and ghosts in the snow. Some suggested the group had seen something they should not have. Others claimed they'd been hunted, either by nature, by the Russian state, or by something far more eerie. The place where they died was once just another pass in the Urals. Today, it bears the name of the expedition's leader, Dyatlov Pass. This is a story of what happened to those 9 brave souls who climbed up the mountain and never returned. They were young, brilliant, idealistic. 10 students and recent graduates of the Ural Polytechnical Institute in Sverdlovsk were brought together by a shared love of the mountains and the unshakable spirit of the Soviet youth that drove them. All of them were either engineers, physicists, or athletes. Each one of them was already certified as a Grade 2 ski hiker. Upon completion of this journey, they would receive their Grade 3, the highest level attainable at the time. To qualify, they would need to traverse over 300 kilometers of hostile terrain in the dead of winter, carrying heavy packs, navigating only by map and compass. In the Soviet Union of 1959, these were considered model citizens, the pride of their generation. Now, at the center of the group was Igor Dyatlov, 23. He was calm, analytical, and deeply respected by the others. He was a student of radio engineering with a reputation for discipline and leadership. He had designed and built the group's stove himself. Friends described him as stoic, patient, and trustworthy, a natural guide through both wilderness and uncertainty. Beside him was Yuri Doroshenko, 21. He was towering, broad-shouldered, known for his boundless energy and fierce loyalty. On a previous hike, he'd fought off a wild bear with nothing but a geologist's hammer, an act of wild courage that became local legend. Lyudmila Dubinina, 20, brought a fierce intelligence and deep emotional strength. She had once taken a bullet to the leg on an earlier expedition when a fellow hiker mishandled a firearm. She kept hiking for miles before seeking help. She was a student of engineering and economics, and she had a sharp tongue and a sharper mind. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, was the heart of the group. She was bright, optimistic, always smiling in the many photographs that was taken from them. She had hiked with Dyatlov before and was known for her grit, her laughter, and an unshakable cheer even in the bitter cold. Alexander Kolevatov, 24, was a quiet enigma. He was tall, cerebral, with a background in nuclear physics. He had once worked in a classified research facility. He was reserved and introspective, and he preferred science to small talk. Rustam Slobodin, 23, was a distance runner and a man of balance. Measured, athletic, a student of mechanical engineering who often brought order to chaos. He journaled meticulously and rarely lost his temper. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, 23, was charming, witty, and known for his easy smile. A civil engineering student, he was the group's mood lifter, someone who could turn a freezing night into a memorable one with a joke or a story. Yuri Krivonishenko, 24, was the clown and the bard, musical, mischievous, and always humming or singing. He had worked at Mayak, the nuclear site responsible for the Kishtim disaster, one of the worst radioactive accidents in Soviet history. He rarely spoke of that. Then came Semyon Zolotaryov, 38, a man apart, older from Dres by over a decade, a mysterious late addition to the group. He was a war veteran, ski instructor, and survivor of the Battle of Stalingrad. He wore tattoos no one recognized and carried a camera no one else knew about. The students called him Sasha. He called them comrades. And finally, Yuri Yudin, 21, the tent man. Racked by joint pain and a chronic illness, he turned back on January 28. It was a decision that saved his life. The others continued forward. 10 entered the Ural wilds. Only one would return. The rest would become names etched into stone, into snow, and into one of the most enduring mysteries of the modern age. On the morning of January 25, 1959, the Dyatlov group arrived in Ivdel, a remote settlement at the edge of the Soviet frontier. From there, they were driven north by truck to the logging outpost of Vizay, the last inhabited place on their route. A small frostbitten village marked the boundary between the known and the unknown. Beyond it, there were no roads, only snow, forest, and silence. They spent a night there, preparing their gear, checking instruments, tuning the portable stove that Dyatlov himself had engineered. They posed for photographs, laughed, they played a mandolin, and wrote in their journals. By all accounts, they were in good spirits, eager to begin the journey northward, unaware that they were writing the opening lines of their final story. On January 27th, they set out. The weather was typical for the northern Urals in midwinter. Temperatures between -20 and -30 degrees Celsius, with snowstorms drifting in and out like the tides. But the group was well prepared. They moved in formation, cutting tracks through the powder. Each day was recorded in photos and journals, capturing jokes, mealtime banter, and even shared songs. Evenings were spent huddled in the tents, steaming snow for water, drying their boots and sketching maps. In their entries, they joked about the cold, poked fun at each other, and marveled at the beauty of the frozen wilderness. On January 28, just one day into the hike, Yuri Yudin turned back. His chronic ailments, rheumatism and congenital heart issues, flared in the brutal cold. Dyatlov shook his hand, and the others bid him farewell. No one imagined it would be the last time they'd be seen alive. Now 9, the group pressed on toward their destination, Autorton, a remote peak sacred to the indigenous Mansi people. Autorton, its name roughly translates as "don't go there." The warning would become bitterly ironic. By January 31st, they reached the edge of a highland plateau. There, in the wooded foothills, they made camp and cached supplies, extra food, tools, and film for the return leg. This was standard procedure, lighten the load before the final ascent. On February 1st, they began crossing the pass toward Autorton. Visibility worsened. Winds howled down from the ridgelines. Snow drifted thick, blotting out the sun. The group lost their bearings and veered west, toward a different mountain entirely, Kolatsiako. Its name, in the Mansi tongue, meant Mountain of the Dead. You can start seeing a certain theme here with mountains called Don't Go There and Mountain of the Dead. Does that imply you can go to the Mountain of the Dead and that nobody dies on the Don't Go There mountain? I don't know. By late afternoon, they realized their error. The map showed they had deviated off course, climbing the exposed eastern slope of Kolatsiako rather than descending to the forested valley beyond. There, just 1.5 kilometers below, trees would have offered windbreak, firewood, and shelter. But they did not go down. Instead, they made a fateful decision to set up camp on the exposed slope just 300 meters from the summit. Some believe Dyatlov chose to stay high to avoid losing elevation, or to test the team's mettle in harsh conditions. Others think they were simply exhausted, blind in the storm, or unaware of how close shelter truly was. Whatever the reason, the tent was pitched on a steep, windswept incline. They carved out a platform in the snow, anchored the guy lines, and settled in for the night. Their journals end there. There are no further entries from the group themselves. No final photos, nothing. Just the bitter, enveloping white, whatever it was that found them in it. The Dyatlov group was expected to return by February 12th at the latest, but no word came. Days passed, and then a week. Initially, no one panicked. Delays were common on treks of this difficulty. But when the silence lingered into February 20th, families grew desperate. The Ural Polytechnical Institute sent out its first search teams, fellow students, teachers, and local volunteers. Soon, however, the Soviet military joined the rescue operations. Planes circled above the Urals, helicopters combed the ridgelines, soldiers trudged through waist-deep snow alongside Mansi hunters and mountaineers. The Ural wilderness offered no answers, until February 26th. That morning, searchers spotted a single black seam of fabric half buried in the snow. It was the tent, and what they found inside would become legend. It had collapsed partially, blanketed with a thick crust of drifted snow. Yet it remained anchored to the slope, the skis still standing as a foundation for the tent. The side of the tent, however, was very much damaged. The side had been completely cut open. Later it was deduced that it had been cut open from the inside, with a long, ragged slash that had clearly not been made at the seams or fastenings. Someone, likely multiple people, had used a knife to escape from the tent through the side wall instead of the entrance. Now, inside, the scene was eerily orderly despite the way it was found. Blankets and boots were still arranged in the tent. A flask of untouched medicinal alcohol was found, as was a camera still stuck on a tripod. In addition, there were journals, diaries, and clothes and coats neatly folded. But there were no people or bodies. Outside in the snow, 9 sets of footprints were eventually found, and they led down the slope toward the forest, some barefoot and some in socks, one even with only a single shoe. The tracks were orderly, not frantic, a calm but inexplicable march into the trees. After about 500 meters, the tracks vanished beneath fresh snowfall, but they pointed toward a stand of cedar trees at the forest edge, 1.5 kilometers downhill from the tent. And that's where the bodies began to appear. The first 2 victims were found beneath a giant Siberian pine, his bark stripped and branches broken up to 5 meters high. Yuri Krivonishenko, 24, lay on his back. His feet were bare, his hands burned black, possibly from clinging to the fire or embers. His skin was tinged orange, likely from the cold's effects on the blood. Beside him was Yuri Doroshenko, 21, who was also barefoot, and he was only dressed in his underwear and a torn shirt. He too had the extensive burns on his hands and legs. Foam at the mouth suggested pulmonary edema, a possible result of shock and hypothermia. Both of them had clearly tried to survive beneath the cedar, with a small fire pit being found, a ring of charred sticks. Pine needles had been piled around it for insulation. Yet the branches above them had been torn down violently. Marks on the bark suggest someone had tried to climb it, perhaps to evade something or to gain a vantage point to search for the tent's light. They had been stripped of their clothes, possibly by the other survivors, or as a result of paradoxical undressing, as a known hypothermic delirium. Paradoxical undressing happens when you are experiencing the later stages of hypothermia or frostbite, and you feel inexplicably hot instead of cold, urging you to take off your clothes as a way to cool down. This, of course, only hastens the inevitable death by frostbite. But the conditions of these bodies raised deeper questions. The burns, the missing skin, the absence of shoes, even in such brutal cold. Their bodies were the first, but not the last, hint that this was no ordinary mountain tragedy. Between the cedar and the tent, spaced at intervals as if struggling to return, 3 more bodies were eventually discovered. Igor Dyatlov, 23, was found face up, fists clenched, and a branch in one hand. His head was bruised. He wore a jacket, but no shoes or hat. Zenaida Kolmogorova, 22, lay face down in the snow with deep abrasions on her hands and face, defensive wounds, some claimed. Her expression was frozen in a grimace. Like Dyatlov, she was pointed toward the tent. Rustam Slobodin, 23, was found with a fractured skull, likely the result of a fall, but the wound was not deemed fatal afterward. He had socks on one foot, a felt boot on the other. The poses of these 3 bodies suggested they had turned back from the tree line, perhaps to reach shelter or rescue the others. All died of hypothermia. Yet their injuries, while lighter than the others near the cedars, hinted at a violent struggle or disorientation, or at least blunt force trauma. One forensic detail stood out. Each had died 6 to 8 hours after their last meal, and none showed signs of internal organ damage, except for Slobodin's fractured skull. It would be 2 more months before the last 4 victims were found. On May 4th, a Mansi tracker and a rescue team spotted the remains of a makeshift snow shelter 75 meters deeper into the forest, in a ravine choked with spring meltwater. There, under 4 meters of snow, lay the final 4. These were the most heavily clothed, possibly wearing items stripped from the earlier dead. Lyudmila Dubinina, 20, had suffered horrific injuries. Her eyes and tongue were missing. Her ribs were crushed inward, broken clean in multiple places. Yet her skin showed no external bruising, no lacerations. Her mouth had bled internally. Semyon Zolotaryov, 38, wore 2 watches and carried a camera no one knew he had brought. His chest was also caved in, his ribs snapped with a force likened to a car crash. His eyeballs were also gone. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, 23, had a massive skull fracture, so severe it would have rendered him unconscious instantly. He too was oddly dressed, with improvised layer made up by different pieces of clothing, not all belonging to him. Finally, Alexander Kolevatov, 24, had burns on his hand, a dislocated neck, and a broken nose. His face appeared flattened, and his eyebrows were missing. No clear cause of death could be determined in his case. These 4 bodies were unusually well preserved, having lain in the stream beneath meters of snow, but all showed signs of trauma that did not align with the typical patterns of avalanche or exposure. Some of their clothing tested positive for radioactive contamination. Dubinina's sweater, in particular, had levels beyond normal background radiation. Furthermore, the scene had no signs of an avalanche, no blunt force from falling trees, no blood trails. The snow was undisturbed around them, as though the mountain itself had closed over them and erased all other traces. The mountain had finally given up its dead, but not its answers. The autopsies on the bodies were swift. By May, the case was closed. The official verdict: a compelling natural force. No criminal element, no fault. The case files were sealed, the terrain was left undisturbed. But in the mind of investigators, searchers, and the families of the 9, questions still lingered. Because what was found beneath the snow defied explanation. And what was not found was even worse. The deeper investigators looked, the less sense it all made. The final report, released by Soviet authorities in May 1959, attributed the tragedy to a vague phrase: a compelling natural force. But in truth, the case was not closed because it was solved, but because no one could explain it. The forensic details were a patchwork of contradiction, too strange to ignore, but too ambiguous to resolve. Now, let us examine what was left behind. Take, for instance, the tent. The hiker's last shelter tells its own story. The tent had been slashed from the inside, with long, frantic knife marks in the fabric, cut not along seams or zippers, but through the body of the material. This wasn't a careful exit, it was sudden, desperate. Yet, inside the tent, everything had remained calm. Bedding was undisturbed. Coats, boots, and supplies were still neatly arranged. One flashlight lay atop the canvas, unlit but operational, as if left as a beacon. The stove was disassembled, suggesting they had not planned to sleep yet. There were no signs of intruders, no blood, no struggle. The tent was erected on an exposed slope, far from natural shelter, an odd choice given that just 1.5 kilometers downhill lay the edge of a dense forest. But the decision may have been deliberate, like I said earlier. Perhaps Dyatlov wanted to practice a high-slope bivouac, or perhaps they intended to descend after nightfall and never got a chance. 9 sets of footprints were traced in the snow, descending toward the forest. Most were barefoot or in socks. Like I said earlier, one of them had time to put on 1 boot. The impressions were measured and calm, not an erratic scatter of a stampede, but a slow, linear retreat by the group. They walked into the forest as though under duress, but not in chaos. After 500 meters, the tracks disappeared beneath new snow. The dead fell in 3 locations: the cedar tree copse, the slope, and the ravine. The first 5, Krivonishenko, Doroshenko, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin, died of hypothermia. Some bore minor injuries, bruises, cuts, abrasions, a fractured skull, but nothing fatal. All were lightly dressed and exposed to wind and snow. The last 4, found in May, told a different story. Their deaths were marked by blunt force trauma of extreme intensity. Dubinina and Zolotaryov's chests were crushed. The pathologist compared the force required to being struck by a speeding car. Thibaut Brignol's skull was shattered, not by falling debris or anything, but, according to the pathologist, by a single lethal blow. But on the contrary with the first 5, none of these 4 showed external wounds matching the internal injuries related to blunt force trauma. 3 of them, though, were missing eyes. Dubinina, the only woman among them, was missing her tongue as well. Part of her lips and fragment of her skull were also gone. Kolevatov's eyebrows had been torn away and his neck was twisted unnaturally. Some of these injuries were attributed to post-mortem decay in the stream where their bodies lay, but their concentration among the most damaged and the absence of similar decomposition in others raised suspicions. And then there was the radioactivity. Forensic testing revealed that 2 of the hikers' garments carried elevated levels of radioactive contamination. Dubinina's sweater and Krivonishenko's trousers were both flagged. Both had worked at Mayak, site of the 1957 Kishtim disaster, a nuclear accident so severe it was kept secret for decades. Some have speculated the clothes were contaminated prior to the expedition. Others suspect a more immediate source directly related to their passing. But no radiation was found at the campsite. No other garments were affected. No cause was ever determined for those traces of radiation. At the funerals of the expedition, relatives noticed something strange. The bodies were deeply tanned with a grey-orange hue. Their hair had turned white or silvery. Officially, these were signs of exposure, natural mummification in wind and cold. But many questioned this. How could so many bodies exposed for different lengths of time show similar discoloration? And why did some have burned hands, as if they had reached into fire? In addition, in the weeks surrounding the group's disappearance, dozens of independent witnesses, miners, hunters, meteorologists, reported strange orange spheres moving through the skies over the northern Urals. One group of hikers, 50 kilometers south, described glowing objects hovering silently at night. A meteorological station in Ivdel logged unusual aerial phenomena. Some claim the Dyatlov group themselves captured photos of lights in the sky, though the negatives remain controversial. Others insist the orbs were never mentioned in official reports because investigators were ordered to suppress them. In 1990, Lev Ivanov, the lead Soviet investigator, confessed he had been told to remove any mention of flying lights from the final report. Like I mentioned earlier, the autopsies were rushed, making the reports of them incomplete and inconsistent. No tests on internal organs were ever published, no toxicology screens were conducted. Time of death estimates were vague, and temperatures during decomposition were poorly recorded. The files were quietly classified and buried in the state archives. By the time the case was officially reopened in 2019, many original documents had simply vanished. Witnesses had already died, of course. Memory had decayed, just like the snow on the mountain. What remained were shadows, photographs of frostbitten hands, diagrams of broken ribs, and the ever-widening distance between fact and fiction. So, what killed these 9 hikers? It is a simple question, but no single theory, scientific, military, or fantastical, can account for every piece of evidence without some sort of contradiction. Some explain the injuries, others the panic. A few account for the lights in the sky or the radiation, but none can explain it all. The Dyatlov Pass Incident remains an open wound in the snowy skin of the Urals, an enigma scarred by partial truths and buried secrets. But now, let us examine the leading theories. In 2019, 60 years after the incident, Russian authorities reopened the case. The conclusion, delivered in 2020, echoed the official narrative of 1959: a slab avalanche. According to this theory, unstable snow above the tent collapsed in the night, pinning part of the fabric and panicking the hikers inside. Believing a larger avalanche imminent, they cut their way out of the tent and fled downslope into the dark, underdressed and disoriented. Some sought shelter at the tree line and froze. Others tried to return to the tent and collapsed partway there. The final 4, those found in the ravine, fell into a hidden snow cavity and suffered traumatic injuries from that fall. A 2021 study by scientists at EPFL and ETH Zurich used advanced modeling to demonstrate how even a small slab of dense snow could produce internal injuries similar to those found in the autopsies. This theory explains much, like the slashed tent, the calm footprints, the descent into the woods, the presence of severe but non-visible trauma. And yet, doubts still lingered with some researchers. There was no visible avalanche debris at the scene. The slope's angle was too shallow to support a typical avalanche, according to experts. The tent also remained partially standing and anchored, and the hikers' footprints remained intact for over 500 meters, impossible if an avalanche had swept down the slope. Some of the injuries, especially Dubinina's missing tongue or other soft tissue damage, are not consistent with a snowslide. In short, it is plausible, and it's by far the most plausible, but it's still incomplete. Another natural explanation centers on katabatic wind. That is a rare meteorological event where supercooled air rushes down a mountain slope at hurricane speed. If such a wind struck the tent, it could have caused a sudden wall of air to collapse the structure, chill the hikers instantly, and create a sense of imminent peril. Faced with suffocating wind, panic, the group may have fled to avoid suffocation or exposure. With temperatures nearing -30 degrees and visibility near zero, they descended down the slope in a panic. The strengths of this theory lie in its subtlety. Katabatic winds leave no trace, no debris, no footprints disturbed. It's just a howling force that comes and goes in minutes. But there are weaknesses with this theory. No similar wind patterns like katabatic winds were recorded in the Urals before or since. The group had time to build a fire and dig a snow shelter, suggesting the storm was survivable. It also does not explain the blunt force trauma that some of the expedition members suffered. It is supposed to be a wind that kills, yet it has touched nothing else. In a 2013 book, Dead Mountain, author Donnie Icar proposed a novel theory: infrasound-induced panic. As wind flows over certain mountain topographies, it can create a Kármán vortex street, a repeating pattern of air disturbances that generates low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of human hearing. These waves, although inaudible, can trigger intense feelings of dread, nausea, disorientation, and even panic attacks. According to this theory, the Dyatlov hikers may have suffered a collective psychogenic episode, fleeing the tent in terror from a threat they could not identify, only to regain their senses too late, scattered and exposed in the snow. This theory could explain the calm footprints, the abandoned tent, the lack of any seemingly struggle, and the sense of irrational silent panic. But infrasound does not explain the fatal physical injuries or the soft tissue damage found in the ravine or in any of the other hikers. It is a compelling psychological explanation why they would flee their tent, but it doesn't leave bruises or shattered ribs. Others believe the answer lies not in nature, but in society. In early 1959, the Soviet military was conducting weapons tests in remote regions of the Urals. Some theorists propose the group stumbled into the fallout of a classified parachute mine test. Those are aerial explosives that detonate above ground, creating powerful shockwaves without leaving craters. Such explosions could cause massive internal trauma without external injury, burns and skin damage, possible even radiation exposure. And it could explain the orange lights witnessed in the sky by hikers 50 kilometers away. This theory poses that the Dyatlov group may have heard the first blast, fled tent, and then suffered injuries from a subsequent detonation or detonations. The scene was then cleaned up or suppressed by state actors. The supporting evidence here is the radiation traces on the clothing, the witness reports of the various orbs and explosions, and reports of classified military presence in the region. But again, as with all the other theories, there are problems with this one. No shrapnel or blast residue was ever found. Most of the trees were undamaged, and there was no official documentation of such tests that were ever made public by the Soviet. If this theory bears any truth, it is probably still hidden beneath the veil of Cold War secrecy, a Soviet tragedy scrubbed from the official record, and we'll probably never know the truth about it. Early speculation by researchers focused on the local Mansi people. They are indigenous reindeer herders with deep ties to the land. Some believe the hikers had violated sacred ground or perhaps damaged a shrine. But this theory was quickly dismissed. No other footprints were found. There was no sign of a struggle. And, most importantly, the Mansi people were known to be peaceful and even willingly assisted in the search and rescue of the missing hikers. The only trace of the Mansi in this tale is their name for the mountain, Kolatsiakl, the mountain of the dead. You could say that they knew the place was cursed, but they didn't curse it or the expedition members. Perhaps, some argue, there is no mystery. The group simply froze to death. The tent was slashed because the entrance was buried in snow, be it due to an avalanche or another factor. They fled in confusion, and then paradoxical undressing, the symptom of advanced hypothermia, caused some to shed their clothing. Others scavenged the dead for warmth. Some fell into a ravine later and suffered injuries from the fall or ice collapse. In this version, there are no conspiracies, no anomalies, just exposure, bad luck, and fear in the cold and dark mountain. But this minimal theory struggles to still explain the surgical precision of some of these injuries, the radioactivity, The burn marks, the missing tongue and eyes, the deliberate tent slicing, and a lack of an attempt to retrieve supplies. It is a clean explanation, but inadequate. Some believe the hikers saw something they should not have. A being, a phenomenon, an intelligence living on the mountain. Theories include extraterrestrial encounters supported by the orbs, radiation, and tissue damage suffered by the expedition. Others say it could have been a Soviet psychological experiment gone horribly wrong. Yet others say it is probably the work of an undiscovered cryptid like the mythical Almas or Yeti. There is even talk of a dimensional anomaly, a tear in the world where physics break and something ancient waits, like a great old one dragging hikers from the snow. But in all honesty, there is no evidence for these theories. Nothing. Zero. What we do have are 9 bodies, dozens of clues, no answers. Every theory leaves something out. Some truth buried in the snow. Some false, natural or unnatural, killed the Dyatlov group. The question is not just what killed them, it's also why they ran into the dark. What did they see? What did they experience before they decided to do so? Yuri Yudin died in 2013. He never stopped searching for answers. Combed the archives, read every report, spoke with many investigators, family members, journalists, conspiracy theorists even. And each year, as winter returned to the Urals, so did the question that would not let him go. Why them? Why not me? He never found an answer. Neither have we. The Dyatlov Pass Incident resists closure not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. It is a mystery composed of fragments, footprints in the snow, a camera left on a tripod, a torn tent on a slope where no one should have camped. It is a puzzle made of trauma, silence, and vanishing light. For decades, it's been dissected by scientists, sensationalists, and skeptics alike, but all of them circle the same void. 9 lives ended by something that defies our categories. Perhaps that is why the story endures. Not because it offers us fear, but because it denies us meaning. The hikers were not foolish. They were strong, they were prepared, brilliant. They did everything right. And still they died. Sometimes in our most rational age, a story comes along to remind us we do not know everything. The world is not a closed system. And the wilderness, true wilderness, is not just indifferent to us. It is unknowable. Now, as always, what do I think happened to the hikers of the Dyatlov group? I do believe that the biggest question for me is also, why did they leave their tents? You could say that the entrance to the tent was blocked, but then why did you cut your way out of it? You could say that, well, there was an avalanche, or they believed there was going to be an avalanche, so they had to make a quick escape. That is a completely valid reason to leave all of your stuff behind in the tent and just make for the nearest shelter that you can find. But then again, there was no trace of an avalanche, so did they misinterpret signs? Then how did they freeze over in a couple of minutes while they were out there trying to find shelter? They tried to make a fire, it couldn't be done, or it did do it, I don't know. Like, if I think about it, the way it should have worked, I do believe, is that they were just in their tent, they were preparing something, they were resting, I do not know, and they suddenly feel that there is something going on. They fear the most, they try to open the tent from the inside, trying to evacuate as quickly as possible to, I don't know, maybe see what's up outside. They can't go through the entrance of the tent, so they slash it open in a bout of panic. Maybe one of them made that executive decision with the rest of them. And they're like, well, it's open now, so we might as well use the exit. And then they noticed that there was something going on that, yeah, maybe it was an avalanche, maybe it was a storm that was picking up. And they said, well, we didn't go down to the bunch of trees that was 1.5 kilometer down slope. So they then decided, well, now is as good a time as any. Then you'd think, like, if they were still running away from a perceived avalanche, they would at least, they would quickly run and they notice that there is no avalanche and return quicker. An avalanche would be a reason to leave your stuff behind because you're like, well, okay, I'd rather be not covered in an avalanche than, take an extra minute to tie my shoes. But then, the moment that the avalanche hadn't come, you would think that they would have returned to the tent sooner than it took them. Again, the fact that their traces, their footsteps were easily traceable shows that there wasn't an avalanche. So if there wasn't an avalanche, then why didn't they return to the tent sooner to catch all their supplies? Maybe they did get their supplies. Maybe 5 of them froze to death. The other 4, who were found in the ravine later, did manage to get back to the tent, get some more supplies, scavenge from the dead who were already frozen, and then started going deeper into the forest to make a shelter, and then dropped into the ravine. To me, this story is researched so many times by many different people, and there are a lot of answers. And most people are pointing towards the avalanche, that they were caught unaware, and then they were turned around, and then they died because, like I said in one of the theories, it's just bad luck, it's confusion, it's fear, and you get turned around in the worst possible situation you could be turned around in. Yeah, even though a lot of people have given their opinions, given their insight, it's always like, yeah, but then there is this and then there's that. I don't believe in any of the supernatural explanations. I don't believe it's an abominable snowman trying to get them. I don't believe it's aliens. I don't believe it's dimensional tears as well. I do believe this is a very human thing. The fact that the Soviet Union was pretty dodgy with their responses almost gives me the idea that the Soviet Union knows more. Then again, it could just be that life is cheap and they didn't really care about it. Could very well be. But yeah, still then, there is still so much that we don't know about the events, the timeline of events, because poor record keeping was part of the problem in the Soviet, in this case at least. We still don't know what the investigators at the time really thought the timeline was. What came first, who died when, and we can only guess. And yeah, that's mostly part of it, why it still intrigues me to this day, why I also wanted to do an episode on it, because despite being so prominent, like you'll see dozens of channels who've already covered the Dyatlov Pass Incident, there are still no answers. This is still one of the more prominent mysteries in history. History's mysteries. I could have named the channel that, although I do think there's a History's Mysteries channel already. Like, I don't know. Anyway, I ascribe to the avalanche and being completely turned around in the snow, turning this into a very dark episode of history. If this story speaks to you, if something about those quiet footprints in the snow or the torn canvas, the missing eyes and the unspoken terror catches in your throat, then let it linger. Let it disturb you. Ask yourself, what do you believe happened on the mountain? If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, let me know in the comments below. And consider leaving a like and subscribing to Mythos Insights for more stories of the strange and the haunted. And if you're intrigued by the world of weird fiction and classic horror, you can find me narrating audiobooks of tales like Conan the Barbarian and The Call of Cthulhu over on my sister channel, Miniature Mythos. Goodbye for now. Until next time, stay curious, keep your mind open to the shadows.